Folks coming in. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Sayre. I'm the Associate Director of Academic Advising at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, and I'm a member of the SAAL Professional Learning and Development Committee. On behalf of the committee, I want to thank everybody for participating in today's structured conversation. This is our October session, and before we get down into it, I want to remind everybody that we are recording this session, and it is also closed caption for those in need. Our SAAL and our committee are committed to involving, featuring, and representing, diverse perspectives and identities in our offerings to meet your professional development needs. You can help us achieve this goal by submitting a structured conversation proposal of your own, and more information about that can be found on our conversations webpage, and we will post that link in the chat. During this presentation today, we want to invite our guests to participate by asking questions, sharing comments, and providing feedback through the chat function that we will be monitoring. To get us started, why don't we ask all of our guests to please put your name and the role at your institution that you fill into the chat so our presenters can get a sense of who's in our audience today. All right, let's take just a moment longer. We've got several of our friends joining us here in the waiting room, I should say. All right, let's move on to today's presentation. Please help me in welcoming our presenters, Drs. Heather Day Strine-Patterson and Ellissa Brooks Nelson. In just a moment, they're going to introduce themselves to all of us and then share their presentation on building a student affairs data lake, data integration for inquiry, improvement, and impact. Doctors?
Melissa, you want to start?
I'll start. So first, I just want to say thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're really excited about this presentation and sharing this information with you. So my name is Dr. Ellissa Brooks Nelson. I am the Divisional Director for Student Affairs Research and Assessment at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I also serve as the SAAL VP for Profession Advancement.
And I'm Heather Strine-Patterson. I am the Director of Assessment, Evaluation, and Data Strategy at Virginia Tech. I just started here 3 months ago. I was previously the Director of Student Affairs Assessment at Appalachian State University. So pieces of my presentation are going to refer back to the work that we did at Appalachian State. Ellissa and I co-presented this at NASPA, and so it's built off of that work. And I'm also the editor for the Journal of Student Affairs Inquiry, Improvement, and Impact. Thanks for coming today. Looking forward to talking with y'all. All right, ready? Okay, I'll go ahead and share screen for our presentation.
All right, so we first want to just start off with some context as far as like, why did we venture out on this journey in the first place? And I first want to start and just say that both Heather and I, while we were working on building student affairs data lakes at each of our institutions, we were doing this silo at first. Like, we weren't aware that each other were doing this work. And we did come together for different purposes and realized we were both in the process of building a student affairs data lake. And so during this presentation, you're going to hear some things that we did very similar. You're going to hear things that we did very differently in our approach. And the reason for that is just because of the culture within our institutions. So I hope that you'll walk away, while there's a lot of work involved in building a student affairs data lake, I hope by the end of this, you'll see that there's a lot of value in doing the work, and it's definitely worth the time and effort. So first and foremost, just to give you some context of why we did this. You know, our student affairs leadership needed more real-time information, really to help them with quick decision-making purposes, but also to help us tell our student affairs story. In higher ed, I mean, it's critical at this point that we're able to show the value and benefit that we bring to students, not only in the classroom, but outside of the classroom. Also, we needed to get student affairs assessment professionals out of the business of constant data matching and analysis that quickly became outdated. And when I talk about this, really what I'm talking about are those spreadsheets. Those multiple, many spreadsheets. I know all of you are familiar with them. By the time you get them all together and combined in a way that you can do meaningful analysis, the data is old and outdated. And then finally, we really need to be able to move from a reactive to a proactive position. We needed to stop waiting on our leadership to ask us questions that come from cabinet meetings or that come from board of trustee meetings. We needed to already have those answers for them. So for today, what you can expect from us is we're first going to start off with just an overview of data integration. So this may be terminology you've heard before, but you don't really know what it means. Or it may be terminology you've heard before, you think you know what it means, but we're going to help you understand what we mean by data integration as we talk about that throughout the presentation. Then we're going to talk about key advocates and partners. So this is incredibly important in the success of building a student affairs data lake at your institution. The key advocates and partners, both Heather and I identified the same entities or individuals to help in the success of building the data lake. And so we're going to talk about that because that's really going to be your first step in planning. The next thing we're going to talk about, which is incredibly important in the strategic part of building out your data lake, is identifying data priorities. This may look different from institution to institution. It certainly looked different for Heather and I. But we're really going to talk about those key takeaways that you need to keep in mind as you're building a student affairs data lake. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up with some examples. So Heather's going to share some examples of how they were utilizing the student affairs data lake at App State through using visualizations and dashboards. I'm going to share how we have already used our data lake for research purposes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk first about what is data integration overall and how does a data lake make data integration easier. And so I always like to start with clear examples, right? The clearest of examples, and I think when most institutions start with thinking about data integration, the easiest place is thinking about your rec sports, university recreation, and those card swipes into those physical locations, right? Both Ellissa and my institutions, I believe this is still true, and here at Virginia Tech it's true, our rec centers use Fusion. So if a practitioner is wanting to get that report of card swipes, you know, who's come into our rec facilities, they go into Fusion and they click on that reports. And as Ellissa mentioned earlier, they're downloading that out of a spreadsheet. And that can provide that department and division, institution, some great information. How many visits did we have this semester or this year? How many unique visitors did we have this semester or this year? And as long as you have a unique identifier of the student, like the ID number or the email, you can answer those questions all from within that Fusion system. When you can answer questions like when are peak periods at our different facilities or when are slow periods, right? You have that card swipe data with the time and the facility that they're swiping into. It's pretty easy. But when you start digging a little deeper and you say, are the students that utilize rec representative of the student population at the institution? All of a sudden, you can't get that in Fusion, right? So you have to go get it from another data silo on campus. And let me visually present this in a little bit different of a way, right? This data is in two different pockets. You can't answer that question from the third-party system, Fusion, alone, and you can't answer it from an institutional data source like Banner, or maybe your campus has PeopleSoft. You can't answer that question just by using that institutional data. So you have to bring those together because it's the joint of those data that tell you the answer to this question, right? But if there is no registrar that I can think that's going to say, well, we'll put all the institutional data of any demographic of a student you want to know. They're going to be like, no, we are not putting that in the third-party system fusion. That is not happening, right? So then if you're like a normal practitioner, your division hasn't built a lake or your institution isn't doing that, you're going and getting 2 different spreadsheets from those different data silos, and you're merging them together through a VLOOKUP or another way that you can merge that data set. And by the time you do that, most people are super busy in student affairs. And so ideally, you're doing that once a year in the fall and spring semester. Maybe in a super ideal format, having to merge that, you do that at the end of fall, right? But in either of those scenarios, we are like a Titanic with data, right? It is hard to change course when we get data that late in the game, because by that time in the game, our students have graduated or they've left. We haven't retained them. They've gone to another institution. And so we're a sunk ship because we can't make changes fast enough. And what we want is that we're getting data on a frequent basis to inform our decision making, right? And improvement efforts. We want to be a sailboat, right? That's able to flex. And so that is what a data lake can provide you. Because if you look at a campus, there are all kinds of systems all over a campus. Here at Virginia Tech, it's over 100 that we have in our division that we're talking about. I just put these from an App State perspective just to give a sense, and we'll give a sense of what Ellissa's dealing with later. And so merging those 2 spreadsheets, and those data sources together is great, but then you take it to another level. And you might say, are students that participate in student orgs and recreation more likely to be retained, right? And if you want to say student organizations, well, that's not in Fusion and that's not in Banner. And so this is where pulling another third-party platform into the mix happens. And it takes all 3 of these data sources to answer that question. So I'll give you an example. And if you are from a third-party company out there, listen, I wanted to make this super clear in this presentation. I've gotten some third-party companies that have been like, well, what is it that you're trying to do? We'd really like to do that for you. Again, I want to emphasize to everybody out there, there is no way that that is happening. Anybody is going to say, no, we are not adding other institutional data into a third-party system that's just built for university recreation. But the questions that we're getting are complicated. And so what a data lake does is it takes those different silos and it puts the data into formats and a place at the institution where then you can dashboard and visualize that in live time. So we're keeping the integrity of student data. We're protecting student data by not putting it into these third-party systems, and we're bringing it all together. All right. So that is data integration and kind of a quick overview of a data lake. And Alyssa's going to talk to us about key partners and advocates.
So for this part of the presentation, we're going to talk about common partners and advocates. And so as I mentioned, these partners and advocates were identified by each of us before I'd ever even met Heather. But they are critical to the success of your data lake. And then we'll talk about 2 different approaches that both Heather and I took. So I'm going to say this is probably your most important partner and advocate in this process, and that is your IT folks. The reason I say that is because if they're not bought into this, it's not going to happen. Unless you have these super IT skills in addition to your assessment and research evaluation positions, you have got to have IT on board, or you do not have really the foundation of what you need to build that data lake. So that is first and foremost a very incredibly important partner. Next are your student affairs professionals. And what we're talking about here is not just your leadership, but your department leaders as well as staff. And for this, I would say the most important folks that you need to have bought in within student affairs are your student affairs staff, because at the end of the day, they are the ones that are collecting the data. They're the ones inputting that data into those third-party systems or into that spreadsheet. But at the end of the day, they are the most important in terms of data quality and validity. But obviously you've got to have your divisional leaders on board. So the way it works at our institution, I cannot submit a proposal to IT if I don't have the support in writing from my vice chancellor. So you've got to have your divisional leaders on board, but I'm going to say your staff are incredibly important here for your success. Additional partners. So institutional research has been incredibly important for us, in particular at UNC Charlotte and building the data lake. They have been our go-to, especially as we've been building out views, which we'll talk a little more about that later. Really to make sure that we are pulling and using the same criteria that they do for things like retention, graduation, etc. Registrar has also been an incredibly important partner, along with legal counsel. So legal counsel, we didn't really need to go to legal in the beginning, because really we were working with more level 1 student engagement data where we didn't need to get approval from legal for certain things. But as we've been building out our data lake at UNC Charlotte, we have started the process of identifying the systems that inform our student health department, as well as counseling and psychological services and conduct. And that is when we started to seek out support from legal counsel to make sure that we were going through that process ethically, and that we weren't doing anything that we weren't supposed to be doing. But that has definitely been a process, and they've been an incredibly important partner in that process. So for our approach at UNC Charlotte, from the very beginning, what was most important was getting that buy-in. If you don't have the buy-in, it's going to be, I'm not going to say it's impossible to build a student affairs data lake at your institution, but it's going to be really, really hard. But the very first thing I did was I needed to get student affairs IT support. If IT was not on board with this, I knew there was no reason to go to our vice chancellor for a proposal if IT wasn't willing to build it for me. And so I went to IT first. I pitched the idea. I shared why having a student affairs data lake would be valuable and beneficial, not only to the division, but to the institution and our students. IT was on board. And when I say student affairs IT, so the way UNC Charlotte is set up, we have this big one IT entity, but we still have certain pockets of IT folks that are dedicated to certain areas within the division. So our student affairs IT folks are a team of 2. And so I went to our team of 2 and said, will you support this if I bring this up to our vice chancellor? And they were like, I don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to do it and we're going to figure it out. So yes, they were on board first. Then I took it to our vice chancellor. So what I've included on this slide in particular are really big takeaways from the proposal, so that if you're interested in doing something similar at your own institution, you have some language to go off of here. But essentially, within that proposal was really that push towards we need to have that single version of truth. We need that go-to place for fast, accurate, reliable data. And we needed an opportunity that allowed for unified data sets that could really help us tell our student affairs story and show how we impact students and student success. And then, so basically I pitched this to our vice chancellor, and I'll be honest, that was an easy win. He's totally on board. He got it. He understands it. He knows this is something we need. So now I've got buy-in from both IT and leadership. So then the next thing I need to do is get buy-in from staff, and then department heads within the division. So the way I did that was by forming what I called a data lake committee. And another reason for this committee is because there were decisions that need to be made, and I had no business making those decisions on my own. And so basically the data lake comprised folks, department heads throughout the division, as well as staff throughout the division. And they really helped me identify, one, what data was going to go into the data lake. And they helped me prioritize what data was going to go into the data lake. And they helped me think through what our data collection was going to look like as far as when we need to make sure that all the systems were updated for the next feed into the data lake and things like that.
So then taking that, what Ellissa just talked about, her approach at UNC Charlotte to our approach at App State, I'm actually just going to change that to my approach because it was just me at Appalachian. And so, again, Ellissa said we had the same partners, but we really worked with those partners kind of in a different order. And I think part of that was really informed by I started as a student affairs practitioner. So I had a divisional IT department, but what I knew is that the practitioners put data into systems and I didn't know how I was going to get it out. I didn't know what that looked like, but I knew I had to work with those practitioners to start getting better data quality going into the systems before I even wanted to worry about how we were going to get it out of those systems. So I really worked from student affairs educators, practitioners to divisional leaders, department leaders, then pulling in IT in more detail. They were great partners. I still call my folks at IT at App State and check on how they are as people, especially after the hurricane. But we also worked with institutional research, the registrar, and legal, as Ellissa said. And so I really think, Ellissa, when we were preparing for this presentation, like Heather, you really took a grassroots approach, and you have to emphasize that because I think that was just a little bit different piece with the culture and the approach I took. So I would go into those conversations with practitioners and say, how does this work? What do y'all do? I want to learn. And then every time I learned that they were on fire and there was a fire around them and they were stressed out and freaked out every time that they were getting asked for data, and it was so much to clean those data sets. And I literally just listened and took notes and asked questions. And most conversations, even though I've been a practitioner for a long time, over 10 years, I would still walk away thinking, you're kidding me. That's what you're doing over there in this different functional area that I've never been in. I always learn surprises. And then it's no wonder we have people that are leaving this field in droves when we're putting so much onto them. And so I would walk away every time and just say, can I help you? Will you let me help you? I want to make this easier. And that made the buy-in for the work that we were doing super easy. I had one person by the time I left at App State, right before we were going to get to Star Res. And my goal, I told her, was that she would never have to fund a front end report out of Star Res again, and that we would get it all dashboarded. And she looked at me and she said, what would my job be if I didn't have to run front end reports? And I looked at her and I put my hand on her shoulder and I said, it would be to look at the data, think about the data, and figure out how you're going to make this better for your department and our institution. And that's how our folks are feeling right now, running all of these front end reports.
So now we're going to shift and talk about identifying data priorities. So what you see here in this visualization is our data lake at UNC Charlotte. So IT put this together for me, but essentially what this represents are all of the different systems within student affairs. And how they contribute and feed into the student affairs data lake. And so all of these are either currently feeding into the data lake or they are slotted to feed into the data lake by the time we're done with the development of the student affairs data lake, which at this time, when IT tells me is December of this year. So we'll see if that's
Woohoo!
Next, yeah. So when you think about identifying systems to feed into your data lake, you need to be strategic, you need to be thoughtful, and you need to not do this by yourself. Also, what I hope you get from this part of the presentation, there is no right way to do this. It's really going to be dependent on your institution, your culture, your staff, and your leadership. But really, you need to start thinking about what data is collected throughout the division. So that's kind of where you start. From there, you need to think about that data and where is the data source coming from? So is it coming from a third-party system? Is it coming from a homegrown system? Or even is it coming from spreadsheets? And in our case, we had all of the above. So step one of identifying systems is start with identifying all the application software at your institution that contains student affairs data. So kind of the way our IT folks went about it was they identified all of the software, and then of that software, which ones already had direct API connections, because for them, they wanted to start there. it wasn't necessarily based on what questions we wanted to answer, but really we focus on those systems with those direct API connections because that's easiest for IT to get into a data lake. So you also want to think about the data that's collected throughout the division in a different way, and that is, how is that data classified? So we're going to talk very specifically about this, but at each institution, you will have different levels of data within your institution, and the way you go about getting that into your data lake is going to be dependent on how that data is classified. So level 0 data. Everyone has this at their institution. This is typically what I consider to be your lowest risk data. Think about, those public dashboards that maybe your institutional research office or some other office that your institution has on the website that's available for public consumption. So that's your level 0 data. And this is typically data that is purposefully made to be available to the public. Your level 1 data, so this is lower risk data. This I typically think about, a lot of our student engagement data where information is not openly shared with the public, but it's not specifically required to be protected by statute or regulation. The next level up is level 2 data. So I think about this as your higher risk data. This data is confidential business or personal information for which unauthorized disclosure could have a serious adverse impact on the institution. I think about student conduct data when we think about level 2. And then the highest risk data, at least that's how I consider it to be, is your level 3 data. This data is highly restricted business or personal information for which unauthorized disclosure would result in significant financial loss to the university. Okay, this is your data for Student Health Center. This is your counseling and psychological services data. This is really that data where HIPAA is coming into play. And this was where I really consulted with legal every step of the way. And I had a lot of one-on-ones, not only with legal, but also department heads and the area ABCs for both health and well-being, Student Health Center, and CAPS. So once you've determined classification of data within your systems, that's going to help you kind of think through how you're going to prioritize the data going into the data lake. Because at the end of the day, you've got to be strategic and thoughtful, and you can't just dump all of them in from every system at once. So at your institution, it may look something like this, where maybe you have a little bit of that level 1 data and a lot more 2, 3. This is an example of what it looks like. Go back.
Sorry, yep.
You're good. This is what it looks like more at our institution. So we have quite a bit of level 1 data, and then we have some level 2 and level 3 data. And so for us, it really made a lot of sense to just start with that level 1 data, get that in the data lake, and then, we would attack level 2 and 3 data later on. And so both Heather and I, we had already kind of gone through this process before we met, but we identified the exact same systems that we were like, we're going to hold off on these and wait for a future time, because we also had not really run into many people that had tried to get like the the Student Health Center data and the CAPS data into data lake formats, right? So we really even weren't quite sure how we were going to go about that process. And so we're like, we know this is going to require a lot more time, a lot more meetings. So we're going to put this on the back burner. We're going to get the rest of the stuff in there first, and then we'll really focus on level 2 and 3 data. And so that's where the Student Health Center data and CAPS data and conduct kind of moved down to the lower list of priorities. That's not to say it's not as important, though. I want to make that very clear. That data is incredibly important. But as far as what the process was going to look like in getting those approvals, we knew that was going to take a lot of time. And so that's why those ended up as lower priority for us.
All right. So then after Ellissa and I, again, had really similar approach and thought around that. The other thing we both really did was say, what data do we almost always need, right? What data are we going and getting from our institutional system? And that's really things where you're thinking about the registrar or your institutional research office and some samples of that kind of data. And y'all are probably familiar with this, is thinking about race, ethnicity, your sex assigned at birth, the admit type or term, academic degree information, academic achievement data, and maybe some Pell Grant eligibility, right? Like you might want to look at socioeconomic status. So thinking about those types of things, then thinking about, well, how often do I need that data, right? You might need it by term. Even though majors can change at any point, maybe you take the census of the semester or the term to say this was their major at that given time, but the next term it might be different. Then you're thinking, well, what data do I need to think about by year? That's something like Pell Grant eligibility, which is why we put that in here. That's a year long. Your Pell Grant eligibility is what it is for the entire year. But then there's data that might not be time sensitive. More often than not, people are not changing their race, ethnicity. And if they do, you probably just want to update it for whatever historical time frame you're looking at, because it more than likely was inaccurate when it was first captured. So those were other immediate needs that we saw and worked with. And then we took here's where we started taking some different approaches. And so Ellissa is going to start with her approach first.
Yeah. All right. So I first want to start off and say that we'd attempted this in the past and we were not successful. And so you may have that experience too. So I just want you to know that that is actually a normal part of the process. I'll say that once I had joined Student Affairs Research and Assessment at UNC Charlotte, we were, our vice chancellor understood that we needed to have better access to our data and we needed to get it in one place. But as far as how to do that, he didn't have the answers to that. So he said to us, get all the data that we have in student affairs and let's get it all in one place. So the plan there was we created a big Google Drive folder and we basically reached out to departments throughout the division and said, hey, upload your data in here. That did not go well. We really didn't have any strategy. There was no planning involved. I continued to ask the question, I understand we're trying to get all the data in one place, but like, what are we trying to do with it? What question are we trying to answer? The response I would always get is, well, we want to tell our student affairs story. Who's heard that, right? A million times. But I was like, I understand that too, but that could be a million things because we do so much in student affairs. So, there was a day where I got a phone call from one of our directors and she was clearly frustrated because she had been told she needed to gather about 10 years worth of event participation information. And she was asking me the reason for that. Like, what's the purpose? This is going to involve a lot of time and resources because they don't just have that data available. They can't just push a button. And I felt her frustration because I was frustrated too. And so for those of you that maybe work or, outside of work have a lot of extracurricular activities or have children like I do, really the only quiet time I get is in the shower. And that's when most of my ideas happen. So I was in the shower one night and I was trying to think through, I was thinking about that conversation with the director. I was thinking about the frustration I'd been feeling. And I was like, how can we go about this a different way? And that's when I really started thinking about, like, at the end of the day, what is it we're trying to do in student affairs? At the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is engage our students so that they feel like they belong, they feel like they're a part of a community. And essentially, we want them to stay and graduate, right? And so that's when it occurred to me that we really needed to have a focus. And so for us, the overarching question that we've used from the very beginning of building out the Student Affairs Data Lake is, how does the UNC Charlotte Division of Student Affairs contribute to students' sense of belonging, engagement, and retention? So basically, when we started out building out the data lake, if there was a data source identified and someone recommended we put that in the data lake, if it did not help us answer this question, we did not add it to the data lake at that time. That doesn't mean it would never go in, but it could go in phase 2 or 3, right? But really phase one, what we were focused on were those programs, initiatives, services, where there is that intentionality around student engagement and sense of belonging. And so I'm really focused on those programs where we are intentionally engaged with students, not for a 1-hour workshop, but for a semester-long program, or maybe a program that lasts the whole year, or like many of our programs that last over time for multiple years. So that's really what I was focused on for part one of building out our student affairs data lake. And then as he reached out to me and said, once we have this data lake built, what data views do y'all need? And so that's essentially, this is the beauty of building the data lake, or the data views. That's where IT puts together basically data sets that pulls from all these different relational databases within the data lake to help you tell your story. And so I was like, that's a really great question, because I know what we need from a divisional level, but I don't know what departments need specifically, because the purpose of this data lake is not just so we can tell our divisional story, but it's also to help, just like Heather said, stop those folks from having to pull 40+ reports a week. We can build data views that do that for them. And so we want this to be helpful, not only at the divisional level, but also for our departments to get a lot of this manual ongoing processes off of their plate so they can actually do their jobs. And so for this, I reached out to each department director that was providing data to the data lake, and they also included staff, and we met with them one-on-one. And so we asked them 2 questions. First question was, what data requests do you regularly submit to IR for reporting purposes? Or what data reports are you regularly pulling out of your systems? So for example, when we met with Student Health Center, we have a nurse pulling 42 reports out of that system each week for internal purposes. And there is no reason that nurse should have to pull 42 reports each week. Another example of this is fraternity and sorority life. Every semester, they have to reach out to IR and ask for GPAs, because all the members need to maintain a certain GPA to stay active, right? They no longer have to do that, because we built a view for them, so they can access that information anytime they need it. Another question we asked departments was, what do you wish you could tell leadership about how your programs or initiatives impact students? And this question baffled most folks that we talked to, because they've never been able to think about data in this way. And they even would stop themselves from telling me what they really wanted to tell me, because they didn't think they had the data that could answer that question. And I said, this is exactly why I'm asking that question, because one, when we have data accessible in the way that we have it with the data lake, for folks that have never seen a data lake or used one, it's really hard for them to wrap their head around what that means. So I was like, you answer that question for me, and then I can let you know if that data exists where we could answer that question, but it also lets me know what folks need. So if we don't have all the data to help answer that question, that lets me know what I need to focus on for phase 2 and 3 of this work. And what I ended up hearing from every department was they wanted to know how students that participate in their programs or initiatives or services compared not only to students that did not participate in those programs, but students that were not involved in any other engagement activities in student affairs.
All right. So now I'm gonna walk through what we did at App State to prioritize these pieces of data, remaining data after the Maxian and kind of Medicat counseling data. I took a little bit different of approach with those systems. Ellissa talked about maybe because again, there's multiple right ways, right? So she started with IT. IT cares about ease of getting the data. So we're gonna start with the systems that are easy to get our data. But that was not the approach that I took, because again, I'm going to highlight it's just me. And so because it's just me, and I feel like everybody's vying for me and everybody wants something, and this looks like a horror, and it feels like a horror sometimes because it feels like everybody wants something. And so my priority was really thinking about what systems do most people use? And so I really kind of went through almost a tallying kind of activity, right? And I said, I need to identify in total the offices that use all these different systems because I want to give everybody a little something, some kind of appetizer at the very least, so that I can kind of get a little bit of pressure off of me. And so I thought about the departments and I tallied up which systems that they used. And then I totaled those systems, right? And then I looked and said, and really like we had this internal system built for check-ins. And that was for kind of feet through the door places, maybe our women's center or our campus activities resource center for student orgs. Our Engage system, the Anthology Engage system, and Time Clock Plus. And those all rose to, hey, more than one department is using those. And really, Time Clock Plus, just from that, rose to the top because it's like, wow, most of our departments are using Time Clock Plus for their student employees. Let's get a win here. And then I thought, you know what? Okay, that's at the top. That's my priority. But now I got to figure out maybe what's my priority 2 or 3. And then I started going back and thinking about those third-party systems like Ellissa talked about. And I knew what they were collecting in those third-party systems, but I needed to figure out what departments were collecting manually outside of those third-party systems. And the more I found out how much folks were doing that, I was just like, I can't, y'all. Like, I'm not even going down the direction of what Ellissa said she did. It's just me. That's a nightmare. I can't even go there. I'm not even going to think about it. So my next pivot became, how do I get this departments to put this manual data into systems that we have? Because I need this manual stuff to go away, right? I can't be having stuff on spreadsheets. And so then I kind of went back to the tallying board and said, well, which offices could use the application, even if they're not currently using the application? And so retallying that, our check-in site jumped up to 4 offices. Thinking about that Engage system, it jumped up to 8. And going through that process, all of a sudden, it went a different way thinking about priorities. And so I went back to kind of figure out the priorities. Where do I give folks that appetizer? And on our campus with our systems at Appalachian, that was Engage. I am not saying Engage is a perfect system, but what I'm saying is it was the system where most departments were inputting data, and that to me helped my priorities. And then once I had those top priorities, then I had the systems that weren't that high sensitivity data that Ellissa talked about, but weren't being used by multiple departments. And that's really where I approached divisional leadership. So Fusion was recreation and StarRes was housing. And I said to our divisional leadership, between these systems, what's the next priority? And there was interest in, improving our recreation facilities and wellness centers for our students. And so that made Fusion rise to the top on that. And so that's really how we set our priorities, was really thinking about staffing and how we can kind of hit the most departments with one system to start getting data into their hands regularly. And so that's how we started thinking about what are the immediate needs and what's the divisional needs. And again, just 2 approaches that maybe you can say, okay, I can handle this. This is achievable, right? I'm not saying it's easy, it's achievable. It's a long road. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint, okay? But let Ellissa and I show you some examples now and Alyssa's going to start. We'll show you some examples of how we've used data that we've gotten into this data lake. Also, can I say, Ellissa, really quick?
Absolutely.
Normally, Ellissa and I, towards the beginning, make a joke. You on your campus, people might call it a data lake. Some people might call it a data warehouse. I don't care if you call it a data ocean or a data pond or a data river, right? It's getting relational databases into a place where we can have them relate and have them being updated in an automatic way, right? So when you work with IT folks or you work with kind of some people sometimes that do this work, they can get very technical. I don't know how many times I get corrected on language. But try to focus on the meaning and what we're saying we need it to achieve. And even Ellissa's IT folks might call this something different. My App State folks, called it something different. And I'm still trying to figure out that language here at Virginia Tech, in all honesty. And I just had a conversation with my director of information technology for our division here, and he laughed when I said, I don't care what we call it. I just want this. And we just had a laugh because sometimes people get really hung up on technology. But I think this will show you we both have, whatever you call it on your campus, we both have some great outcomes from this work.
And just to piggyback on that, I'll say that I first started calling it a data mart. That's what I called it in my proposal. I had one group of IT folks calling it a data store. And then the big IT finally said, it's a data lake. Like that's what you're wanting. So I was like, cool, that's what I want. I want a data lake. As long as it can do what I asked for it to do, you can call it whatever you want. So
that's right. That's it.
So basically, we are in the beginning of year 3 in building out our student affairs data lake. So I just wanted to kind of give you that context. And kind of around the beginning of year 2, we were able to respond to a proposal from the National Association for Campus Activities. And so that's important to understand the timing because our student affairs data lake is still not fully developed. But the way our IT folks have gone about it is as they built the data lake, they first put the data in what they call the sandbox. For any of you that are IT familiar, that might sound familiar to you. For others, it might not, and that's cool. You don't need to worry about it. Basically, in sandbox is where they clean the data and make sure the data is in a good, reliable format before they move it into production. Once it's moved into production, we know that data is reliable and valid and can be used. And so we had quite a bit of data in production at the time that I responded to this proposal. And so I also want to point out that I would not have been able to respond to this proposal if we didn't have the data lake. Because there's no way I could have had time to get all the data I needed to get my hands on in a format that could be analyzed within the time frame I was given to do this research. So basically with the proposal, you submit a timeline, and I submitted a timeline that gave us a year to do the analysis using the data lake data as well as focus groups. We were awarded this grant, only they cut my timeline in half to 6 months. If we didn't have the data lake, there's no way I could have accepted that award. But I said, okay, challenge accepted, and we're going to get this done in 6 months. And we did. So I'm going to share with you results from that research. So the research, go back real quick.
Oh, okay, sorry.
You're good. So the research was really guided by the broad question, how does student engagement in student affairs programs and initiatives impact student success and sense of belonging? And the specific aims for this research was focused on examining differences in student engagement in student affairs programs and initiatives, as well as examining relationships between students' level of involvement in student affairs programs and initiatives and sense of belonging, retention, and graduation. I am not going to go into details about the methodology that we used for this research because we simply don't have time. However, if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to me later and we can definitely schedule a one-on-one. Now you move forward.
All right.
So I also want to make clear here that this is the first time ever that we've been able to analyze student affairs data in this way. So we're able to identify students engaged in student affairs programs and initiatives at varying levels over time. So from lower engaged to higher engaged, and then compare them to students who have never been engaged in student affairs programs or initiatives while enrolled at UNC Charlotte. So in the past, we would get requests, I want to look at students that participate in this program and compare them to students that did not participate in this program. And so we never were able to really look at a true comparison group because we never had data accessible in that way to do that. So we would have a comparison group, but we didn't know what else those other students were engaged in. So even though they weren't engaged in that particular program that we were focused on, that doesn't mean that they weren't engaged in other programs or initiatives in student affairs. Next slide.
All right.
So what we ended up finding with this research was significant benefit in student engagement in student affairs programs and initiatives on sense of belonging, retention, and graduation. And we're going to look at some of these results more closely. So sense of belonging. So I want to make a mention here real quickly. Getting sense of belonging data for all students at UNC Charlotte has been a process in and of itself. And I could do a whole presentation on how we went about doing that. But I'm just going to say that relationship building is really important. So we were able to collaborate with our friends in academic affairs to get 3 sense of belonging questions added into our Connect system, which if you have something similar on your campus, it might be Navigate, but it's from EAB. But basically, that's how we're able to get that sense of belonging data from students. And we get that data from students anytime they log in to that system to schedule an appointment with their advisor. So what we found here were students who are not engaged at all, and students who are lowest and lower engaged experience a significantly lower sense of belonging compared to students who are higher and highest engaged in student affairs programs and initiatives. Next slide. Retention is my favorite. So students who are retained participate in a significantly higher number of campus activities when compared to students who were not retained. Now, what's really notable here is any engagement in campus activities significantly predicted a higher probability for retention. So as engagement levels increased, so did that likelihood of being retained. And when we put this in a regression model, for students who are highest engaged, they were 21 times more likely to be retained compared to students that were not engaged at all. Next slide. And then 4-year graduation. So students who graduated within 4 years participate in significantly higher number of campus activities when compared to students who do not graduate in 4 years. So really to summarize that, results support prior research that we've seen out there emphasizing the value of student engagement, promoting significant benefit to students' overall experience and success. But with the data lake accessible in the way that it is, we can now finally show the value and benefit in participating in student affairs programs and initiatives overall. So it's not program specific, it's not initiative specific, but this really is showing at the divisional level how we're impacting our students.
So at App State, just to show you, I built these things in Tableau. I had some graduate assistant support with that. So just to show you at first, here's some Fusion data, UREC. Looking at months, we did update this from last time, but you can see the total number of unique users that came, their number of visits. We could break that down to say, show me what the demographics of all students at Appalachian are. How do the demographics of UREC users look? And then what are the demographics of non-users so we know who to reach out to? We could change this. This was a breakdown by first gen. We could change that to race if we wanted to, and then that would change in a different way. We also could break it down by college. This was super informative for the director of UREC there. We saw easily from this data that our graduate students were actually not using university recreation. So that prompted a collaboration and conversation between folks at the graduate school and university recreation. With student organization data, we were able to show, build in the policy. So there was a policy that every student organization have an advisor. We had students organizations were supposed to have a president and a vice president. Well, sometimes a student was the advisor. Sometimes the president was also assigned the vice president role. And with this, we were able to double check and confirm that those things were not happening. So here, true is that they have an advisor and it's not a student, that they have a president and that they have a vice president and the vice president is not assigned the president role. So this was super helpful for our campus activities office. And then just before I left, we were able to start connecting that student organization data with institutional outcomes. So were students that were members of student organizations in fall 2021, were they retained in spring 2022? Did they come back or did they successfully graduate? And here you can see this dotted black line is that persistence rate term to term across the board at Appalachian State. The yellow is the persistence rate if you're a student organization member, clearly always above the average of students. And if you are not a student organization member, there is clearly always a relationship where those students are not persisting at the same rates. We could do the same thing with retention. We're going to be writing that for a JSAT article. The difference that we're going to propose is the difference between persistence and retention, but I know we're cutting short on time. We did the same thing with GPA, y'all. And a lot of times I don't like to do GPA. You know, I have a thing with my UREC director. Somebody said, we need to map GPA to university recreation. And I said, well, let's just be prepared if that doesn't show us what we want. Well, if that's true, then we need to change some things. After that meeting, I said to the director, what are you going to do if I show you that if a student comes to your rec centers more than 7 times a week, that they have lower GPAs? Are you going to turn them away and say, go to the library? I don't think so. So I think we need to be intentional when we're connecting it with GPA, but we are trying to push back on a story here that says if students are involved in organizations, that it's detracting from their academics. And here with this dashboard, we can show that's not true. We can show that here's the GPA average term to term, and student organization members are always consistently above that average. So we can push back on that story that it detracts from their academics. And again, we're going to recap. I know we're kind of cutting it close on time here, but our final thoughts, focus on the people. It's all about relationships. Always be curious. Don't think you know what a department's doing, because I guarantee you don't. Don't be intimidated by what you don't know. Evaluate your third-party platforms for their ease to get your data out of their systems. Don't let them act like it's their data. It's your data. You pay for those systems, and plan on taking it longer than you expect.
And then for me, my final thoughts, I'd reach out to our IT folks and said, we're doing this presentation, and what's some final thoughts that you would want me to leave with the group? So first thing they said was start simple. And I totally agree with them on this one. Don't try and do it all at once. It's going to be really hard to be successful that way. It's really hard to be strategic and thoughtful, trying to get everything done at one time. So start simple. Use existing software or software that is free or open source. So when we first started out, building out the data lake, it was being built in a SQL environment using MariaDB. All of that's free. I don't know what MariaDB means, but if you're interested, I can get you hooked up with our IT friends. Take time to clean up the data. So you know the saying, garbage in, garbage out. This was incredibly important to me as well as IT and for data governance, of course. But really take the time to clean that data. It's really important that data is reliable and valid when you start to use it. Establish standard timelines for data collection. So this has been really important in our process. So especially for those staff that are responsible for getting data input into those systems, we send them reminders every semester. Hey, make sure your data is up to date. IT is about to pull this data to update it into the data lake. So make sure you have that established. Develop a standard data collection protocol. So we did very similar to what Heather described. All those spreadsheets, we moved that into a third-party system. So we are no longer dealing with spreadsheets in the division. And acknowledge this is going to take time. You're going to have patience along the way. There's going to be a lot of trial and error. Things you think is going to work is not going to work. And then you're going to need to pivot. And that's definitely part of the process. And relationships. So from the very beginning, I was told IT was not going to approve this proposal. Guess what they did? I was told there's no way we can get sense of belonging data from all of our students. Guess what we did? But that's all been based on relationships. And so it's really important that you nurture those relationships, you build those relationships. I did a lot of one-on-ones, just meeting folks in IT before I ever submitted a proposal so that they knew it was coming. And they even helped me make sure that proposal got accepted to make sure that we had the right information in there.
I just switched to that to make sure if y'all want our contact information that you can find us. We encourage you to connect with us on LinkedIn to start that reach out. And I know we started a little late, but happy to stay after here and answer questions if folks want to. I'm gonna stop sharing so we can see people.
Right, wonderful. Well, thank you for your presentation. excellent information. I think we all got a unique insight into how to initiate this data collection on our individual websites, or excuse me, our individual campuses. I beg your pardon. At this moment, I'm going to stop the record, but
Thank you.
we're going to keep this line open, this room open. So if you would like to exit at this time, please feel free. Just remember that this material will be available on our SAAL website. And we also want to encourage anyone who's considering proposing their own structured conversation to do so. That link for proposal is also on our website. So if you'd like to stay and do a little Q&A